What a way to start a wonderful evening. Good evening. My name is Lucy Comstock-Gay, and I'm the president of the Concord Public Library Foundation. And on behalf of the foundation, I'm delighted to welcome you all to a very special Concord Reads event. Tonight we kick off our third season of Concord Reads with this year's celebrated author and poet Donald Hall and 4 other major American poets, which is just incredible. We're truly fortunate this evening, and we thank you all for being here. The goal behind Concord Reads is to promote literacy for sure, but also to bring people together to form new connections over a common shared experience. So as we bask tonight in this literary glory, please be sure to say hello to the person next to you and pick up a Concord Reads Donald Hall button so you can make those connections on Main Street and at the grocery store. The Concord Public Library Foundation, whose mission is to raise funds from the community in support of our library, is proud to be a lead sponsor of this year's Concord Reads. But this couldn't have happened without generous support from all across the community. I would like to thank very sincerely the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and the Merrimack County Savings Bank Foundation for backing this project with generous grants, and Jefferson Pilot Financial for supporting tonight's special birthday celebration. In addition, key support came from the Concord Monitor. Mike Pride, Tom Brown, and Ralph Jimenez, you guys were incredible in pulling off this event, and wasn't that supplement in Friday's paper terrific? So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Michael Herman of Gibson's Bookstore, Chris Cornog of Paxton Communications, and Lisa Swanson Design. And last but certainly not least, Lisa Sands of the Concord Public Library Foundation, and Robin Bailey and Pat Iman of the library. We are also very grateful to Mayor Donovan, Duncan Ballantyne, and the City Council for their support, the Friends of the Audi for this wonderful space, Bread and Chocolate for the cake we'll be enjoying later, and McLeod's Florists. So please enjoy this evening's once-in-a-lifetime program, and please do join us afterwards for cake and refreshments as we all wish Mr. Hall happy birthday. And also, don't forget that tonight is just the first of 5 events and discussions featuring the works of Donald Hall. Other events will be happening between now and October 17th in various locations around town, and we hope you'll all join us there. And finally, I can't neglect to mention that if you enjoy programs like Concord Reads and want to see them continue and grow, that we would welcome your contributions to the Library Foundation and your volunteer support to the Library Friends. And now please join me in welcoming again Mike Pride, editor of the Concord Monitor, who will get the festivities underway for tonight. Truly, Mike, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see this crowd. That was my big worry in trying to help put this together, is that we would have a good crowd out here tonight. As some of you may know, I spent part of my summer in St. Petersburg, Russia, visiting my son and daughter-in-law. And one of the places that we visited was the apartment of Anna Akhmatova, one of the best-known 20th century Russian poets. She lived in a part of a palace, but her apartment was not particularly opulent in any way. It's a nice apartment, high ceilings. But right outside in the courtyard, there's a tree, and on that tree, people who come to visit scribble a few lines of poetry or a lot of lines of poetry, and they put it on the tree, and they call it the poet tree. And I found this a wonderful idea and a wonderful public expression of appreciation for poetry in Russia. And I think that having a crowd like you tonight is a wonderful public expression of this community's appreciation for poetry. And I'm really glad you came, and I'm glad we were able to bring these poets together. We'll do our best tonight to have you out of here in time for Monday Night Football. I know that Don Hall approves of your interest in Monday Night Football. because he once wrote about Monday Night Football in a poem about some loose heifers on Route 4. Before I introduce the program, I want to ask you all to please stand up. You really can't, you know that today is Donald Hall's 76th birthday, and you really can't have a birthday party without singing Happy Birthday. So on 3, I'd like you to join me. I may step back from the microphone just so you don't. I'd like you to join me in singing Happy Birthday to Donald Hall. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Donald. Happy birthday to you. Great job. Thank you very much. I'm not going to take too much time with the introductions because I know you don't want to listen to the only person on this stage who is not a famous American poet. But I do want to tell you one quick story about Don. I've had many opportunities over the years to introduce Don to various groups, to listen to him talk and listen to him answer questions from audiences. Last December, we were down in Cambridge speaking to the Neiman Fellows. During the discussion, one of the fellows asked Don about a book by Robert Frost called In the Clearing. It was clear from the fellow's question that he didn't think much of this book. Don agreed that indeed the book was not one of Robert Frost's best. He calculated quickly, knowing as he does the work of Robert Frost, that there were probably 2.5 great poems in this whole book. But, he said, the questioner should at least consider that Frost was 88 years old when he wrote In the Clearing. What do you expect? Don asked. Then he paused for a moment, and sort of under his breath, he said, well, I expect a lot more of myself. I was reading the Writer's Almanac on the web today, since they don't play it on the local public radio station, and they did write about Donald Hall's birthday. Said it was his birthday today and gave a little bit of a biography and a nice little capsule about him. And it ended with a quote from Donald Hall. It said, I try every day to write great poetry, as I tried when I was 14. What else is there to do? I think those words say a lot about Don's determination, and they're part of what make his life such an inspiration. To celebrate Don's life in poetry so far, we are joined this evening by 4 truly fine American poets who also happen to be close friends of Don's. They have all agreed to do something that less accomplished poets might not do, read the work of another poet. I'm going to introduce them all now, very briefly, in the order in which they will speak. First will be Cynthia Huntington, who lives in Hanover and directs the creative writing program at Dartmouth College. After Cynthia will come Wesley McNair, who taught for many years at Colby Sawyer College in New London and is now about to retire, or has retired, as the head of the creative writing program at the University of Maine in Farmington. After Wes, we'll hear from our own Maxine Kuhlman of Warner, who is working on her 15th book of poetry in her 80th year of life. In 1973, Maxine won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Next will be Robert Bly, who has known Donald Hall for 56 years. A book of Robert's poems won the National Book Award in 1969. And finally, we will hear from Don Hall, the author whom Concord reads this year. Cynthia, welcome to Concord.
This is wonderful. I'm here tonight with my lozenges. It's much better than listening to me cough into the mic. I'm here tonight in my most official capacity as Donald Hall's former student. Like many of Donna Hall's former students, I never actually took a class from Don. But we've had a long correspondence, which continues even though we both live in New Hampshire. I met Don during his last year of teaching at the University of Michigan, just before he moved to New Hampshire. He's been my teacher ever since. He was incredibly generous, and I have promised not to use that word again, because Don is tired of hearing it. Don has asked that instead we focus on his work tonight, and I'm happy to do that. I mean to pay him tribute here as a student best pays tribute to a teacher by demonstrating that I have learned something from him. To be a first-rate poet, you must first be a first-rate reader of poetry. So I would like to read and teach you a few of Don's poems. The first poem I'm going to read is from the collected identified as 1959 to 1963, New Hampshire. A bear sleeps in a cellar hole, pine needles heap over a granite doorstep. A well brims with acorns and the broken leaves of an oak, which grew where an anvil rusted in a forge. Inside an anvil, inside a bear, inside a leaf, a bark of rust grows on the tree of a gas pump. Eat signs gather like leaves in the shallow cellars of diners. A wildcat waits for deer on the roof of a car. Blacktop buckled by frost starts goldenrod from the highway. Fat honeybees meander among raspberries, where a quarrel of vines crawls into the spilled body of a plane. Don talks at length about the importance of sound in poetry, often pointing out particularly how assonance may play much more deeply on our emotions than the more brutal forthright use of alliteration. These vowel sounds shaped from the throat, shaping the breath. And there are wonderful, subtle vowel shapes in this poem, which Don would like you to hear again. Sleeps, needles heap. The bear sleeps in a cellar hole. Pine needles heap. Those E's up there high, played against the broken leaves of an oak, the broken oak. And then again we go back to those E's in the second stanza, where eat signs gather like leaves in the shallow cellars of diners. And then we have a whole little series of high I's. The signs in the diners lead us to the wildcat. And then the bees meandering. There's also some off-rhyme that Don would like you to hear in here. It's all subtly placed, not at the ends of lines and not places where we have to stumble over it, but places just to please our ear with the reminiscence of the sound we've heard recently. Cellars and diners, bees and raspberries. And my favorite in this poem, where a quarrel of vines crawls into the spilled body of a plane. Don talks at length about the importance of clarity, which is not to say realism. This poem is clear in imagery, in phrasing, in syntax and sentence structure, and in overall sense. I would hold that it's not necessarily realistic. Where was that plane? This plane shows up in way too many poems to be taken seriously as a realistic. It's a plane, definitely an airplane of the imagination. Most of all, Don shows by statement and example that our real subjects choose us, not we them, and that they're never exhausted. Too much can be made of novelty. The deep subjects constantly reinvent themselves in us. For instance, New Hampshire, a constant and recurring subject and preoccupation in Don's work. How many New Hampshires will we see in Don's poems? Here, writing in Ann Arbor nostalgically of a New Hampshire he figures as lost, a place he can't ever really live in, all the imagery is of death. Death and loss with a little surrealism and a little irony thrown in. A younger man's bravado to distance what seems unattainable. Cellar holes, ruined diners, dried up wells, and highways going back to grass and weeds. And that wrecked plane dragging the ruin of history even more specifically, if not factually, into the equation. New Hampshire is a personal subject for Don, And in this poem, the personal subject intersects the grand subjects of death and mortality. Again, Don has taught us we don't need to go looking for the new theme. Sex and death and love and hate will continue to do. They change for us, too. For the young man, death happens to other people and represents a kind of a failure, at least a running out of energy, which thought is anathema to the young. So we have the surrealism and the irony of the buried eat signs, and no hint of really being afraid here. The past lets us down by dying, but we're pretty immortal ourselves, unless we get on the wrong plane. Second poem is written in the late 70s, shortly after Don has moved back to New Hampshire. It's a favorite of mine. It's called Old Roses. Old white roses, tiny and old, flare among thorns by the barn door. For 100 years, under the June elm, under the gaze of 7 generations, they lived briefly, like this, in the month of roses, by the fields stout with corn, or with clover and timothy making thick hay, grown over now with milkweed, sumac, paintbrush. Old roses survive winter drifts, the melt in April, August parch, and men and women who sniffed roses in spring and called them pretty, as we call them now, walking beside the barn on a day that perishes. Listen to the sounds made here again, subtle and intertwined. Don is always a formalist, even when working in free verse. Old roses, white, tiny, thorn barn, thorn door, June generations. Those plays of words twine through the poem the way the roses twine around the barn door. By the late 70s, when Old Roses is written, Don has returned to New Hampshire, and Old Roses is, among other things, a homecoming poem, kind of half apologetic to the generations who are lost. A little throat clearing as the narrator assures us he knows this day also will perish, yet not only with apology toward the former generations, but a sort of joining hands with them. It is curiously bridal in tone, this image of the June white roses, the we who call them pretty, the sense of return to a family house. Now he is writing about New Hampshire, but with self-conscious delight. The speaker and his wife in Old Roses seem a long way from death, but are aware that what they inherit in these old roses, this old barn, is a gift passed down through generations. It is a gentle idea of mortality, a life that perishes in compliance with the natural order of things. And though the speaker seems to accept this death, I would say it's still a little bit outside of him. Excuse me. Listen now to a last poem from a decade later. Not the last poem, my last poem. My poem to New Hampshire will be about germs. Moon clock. Like an oarless boat through midnight's watery ghost house, through lumens and shallows of shadow, under smoky light that the full moon reflects from snowfields to ceiling, I drift on January's tide from room to room, pausing by the wooden clock with its pendulum that keeps the beat like a heart certainly beating, to wait for the pause allowing passage to repose's shore, where all waves halt, upreared and stony as the moon's Mycenaean lions. Those gorgeous vowels and sibilants. He gives us the moon's Mycenaean lions to distract us to think it's about alliteration, but it's about vowels and sibilants. Oarless boat, ghost, snow, the shallows of shadowy, smoky, snowfield to ceiling, and then that little wave-like passage, pause, allowing passage to repose's shore, all halt. Even the moon's Mycenaean lions, that is a sibilant last line, stony as the moon's Mycenaean lions. By the late 80s, Don doesn't have to write about New Hampshire anymore. He writes from within it. This poem is the poem of the householder, and it appears to be an old house. At least it appears to be an old clock. The speaker here doesn't seem as self-conscious about his place in the scene. He's in possession of his life and home. He walks around at midnight without turning on a light. He has errands to keep him up. Death, moon clock counts the beats. Death here is the death present in every moment, as ancient as Mycenae, no older, as ancient as the moon, and the wooden clock counts beats like a heart certainly beating, which will pause only on the edge of eternity. Freeze frame. It is the death that belongs to each of us, surely, without exception, and it is beating with our life. Now I have exhausted my time without exhausting these poems, which is right, as it should be. Don did teach me some other things, which I'd be happy to go into. But one of the things he taught me is that when you have finished what you came to say, you should go sit down. Happy birthday, Don.
I met Don Hall in 1976, introduced to him by two former students at his Wilmot farmhouse, Terry and Gary Rayno. They might be here in this hall tonight. Don was 48 years old, an established poet with several books and anthologies to his credit. I, on the other hand, was 34, a poet who had no books at all, and besides that, walked funny. The reason I walked funny was that I was trying not to drop a chapbook manuscript of poems I held under my coat and desperately wanted Donald Hall to see. After my visit with him, I drew the manuscript out of my folded coat, put it on his kitchen table, and got out of the house as fast as I could. Imagine my pleasure when 2 days later I received a letter from Don, the first of a handful I want to tell you about tonight, saying he liked my poems. I was dazzled by your poems, he wrote. I carried that letter around with me for a long time, possibly even slept with it, until I finally misplaced and lost it. But never mind, I still have the memory of being invited to Don's house a week later. The warmth of the occasion increased by 2 generous servings of bourbon. And I remember something else. To show how hopeful he was about the poems of his soon-to-be published book, Kicking the Leaves, he crossed not his fingers, but his arms and legs, making his whole body into a giant pretzel. There went my impression of the security of the established writer. It's never clear whether you're any good until after you're dead, Don said. This meant that all poets, established or not, were fated to be as insecure as I was. I see now, looking back, it also meant you had to try for something even harder to achieve than the publication of a book. You had to try to last. But one lesson at a time. And for me back then, trying for the book was hard enough. In letters Don sent me in the late 70s and early 80s, as I expanded my chapbook into a full collection, he was a continuous ally, concerned especially with the language of my poems, with particular words. About this word of yours, yearning, he wrote, can't you hear Bing Crosby sing it? It's Tin Pan Alley. And the word reminds me of the most prosperous poet ever to emerge from Tin Pan Alley. I mean, Rod McEwen. Once, after seeing a long and self-adoring biographical note I had sent to Poetry Magazine to accompany the publication of 2 poems, Don wrote, I think it is wise not to load on the fellowships and academic appointments. If I were you, I'd try something that is quite reticent, non-academic, and non-successful, like Wesley McNair lives in New Hampshire, where he raises goats with eyes in the middle of their foreheads. In another letter, he recommended the poetic practice of waiting. Hold poems back for a long time before you show them to anybody, he said, because a poem has a way of changing on its own before anybody else's words get into it. I think, he added, you already do this. He was right. As a poet who'd been working for a long time on a collection he despaired of ever publishing, I had developed all the expertise in waiting I would ever need. Don responded to my discouragement by telling me to forget about the rejection slips I'd received for the manuscript and get to work. The writing, he wrote in June of 1979, is what matters. Keep making the manuscript better, improving it every time it comes back, and you will win through. 2 years later, in May of 1981, when it still wasn't published, he offered the same advice. Continue to change it, he told me. Make it the best book possible. Yet Don's most moving counsel in this period was not an upbeat call to discipline and work, but the bittersweet commiseration he offered in a letter dated July 8, 1980, which mixes advice to me in my disappointment about not yet publishing a book with the disappointment he himself had begun to feel after publishing several. Believe me, the letter says, I am sympathetic with your feelings. But let me tell you that when you publish a book, nothing will happen. Or at least it will seem that nothing has happened. Even if something happens, then you realize that something is truly nothing. And after you've published 8 books of poems, you're still convinced that nobody reads you, and that probably you're no good anyway. Or at least you're convinced of that frequently. I have been going through quite a bad patch in my feelings about my own ability, my past work, and certainly my present work. He goes on, there is only one place or one moment in which one finds happiness, and it is always momentary because that is the moment of the actual writing, and of course that moment is not always true. So I do 2 things. I assure you that you will publish, and I tell you that it will not make any difference. But I do have a third thing to say. It makes a difference to me. Mind you, when he wrote this letter, Don was on his way to a series of the most important volumes he would ever publish as a poet, books that went beyond anything he had yet done in their range and technique and feeling. So the note of despair you hear in that letter, unusual in Don's correspondence, is in part the sign of a poet taking stock of the limits of his work so far as he gears himself up to deepen his poetry and bring it fully to life. I see this clearly now. But what I saw when I first read the letter as a younger poet was how honest Don was in sharing his own difficulties as a poet with me, and the marvelous generosity of that last sentence. It makes a difference to me. Those words alone carried me all the way to the publication of my first collection 3 years later. I learned about that publication by phone from the editor of the University of Missouri Press, who said my book had won the Devens Award, and after I hung up and screamed a while and told my wife Diane, I called Don to tell him. Wes, Don replied, I could kiss you. I could have kissed him too. As I have said before, I could have kissed the first 10 people I saw. My elation was right up there with the thrill I felt when I placed my first poem in a literary magazine, or read Don's letter about my chapbook manuscript, or listened to Don dedicate a poem to me at a reading he gave shortly after I left that chapbook on his kitchen table. The reading I refer to occurred at my place of work then, you just heard, Colby Sawyer College, and I had the distinct impression when he dedicated that poem to me that he was holding the door of poetry open and asking me in, as I have no doubt he's done in one way or another over the years for dozens of poets, including as we just heard, Cynthia Huntington. My sense of that invitation was why I woke up the next morning at dawn and walked up and down the country roads of North Sutton, the town where I lived, unable to contain my excitement. So tonight I want to read the poem Don dedicated to me back then, with thanks to him for all the excitement and for all he did to make my entry into poetry possible. The poem, this beautiful poem, which I'm sure many of you know, is called Names of Horses. All winter, your brute shoulders strained against collars, padding, and steer hide over the ash hames to haul sledges of cordwood for drying through spring and summer for the Glenwood stove next winter and for the simmering range. In April, you pulled cartloads of manure to spread on the fields, dark manure of Holsteins and knobs of your own clustered with oats. All summer you mowed the grass in meadow and hayfield, the mowing machine clacketing beside you while the sun walked high in the morning. And after noon's heat, you pulled a clawed rake through the same acres, gathering stacks, and dragged the wagon from stack to stack and the built hayrack back uphill to the chaffy barn, 3 loads of hay a day from standing grass in the morning. Sundays, you trotted the 2 miles to church with a light load of a leather quarter-top buggy and grazed in the sound of hymns. Generation on generation, your neck rubbed the windowsill of the stall, smoothing the wood as the sea smooths glass. When you were old and lame, when your shoulders hurt bending to graze, one October, the man who fed you and kept you and harnessed you every morning led you through corn stubble to sandy ground above Eagle Pond and dug a hole beside you where you stood, shuddering in your skin, and lay the shotgun's muzzle in the boneless hollow behind your ear and fired the slug into your brain and felled you into your grave, shoveling sand to cover you, setting goldenrod upright above you, where by next summer a dent in the ground made your monument. For 150 years in the pasture of dead horses, roots of pine trees pushed through the pale curves of your ribs. Yellow blossoms flourished above you in autumn, and in winter, frost heaved your bones in the ground. Old toilers, soil makers. Oh, Roger, Mackerel, Riley, Ned, Nellie, Chester, Lady, Ghost. Names of Horses is, of course, an elegy. And I've long felt that whatever else he may be as a poet, Donald Hall is our American elegist, the most accomplished and various we now have, a poet with an especially keen sense of loss and the need to memorialize that which has been lost. So in a way, he was preparing himself as a poet all his life for his most difficult subject, that is, the death of Jane Kenyon, which caused him such personal grief and pain, as we know, and left him with only poetry to mend himself. The result has been some of his most extraordinary poems, I think, including the one I want to read in closing, Weeds and Peonies. You may remember the situation of this poem in which Don paces between the weedy garden Jane has left behind and her newly blossoming peonies by the porch of the farmhouse, likening the blooming and scattering petals of the peonies to snowflakes in a blowing storm. We think of Jane's peonies, of course, the ones in life and the ones in her poems. And speaking of poems, please notice the reference as I go along to Don's poem, Old Roses, which Cynthia has just read, about the beauty of old roses and how quickly that beauty perishes. Weeds and Peonies. Your peonies burst out white as snow squalls, with red flecks at their shaggy centers, in your border of prodigies by the porch. I carry one magnanimous blossom indoors and float it in a glass bowl, as you used to do. Ordinary pleasures, contentment recollected, blow like snow into the abandoned garden, overcoming the daisies. Your blue coat vanishes down Pond Road into imagined snowflakes with Gus at your side, his great tail swinging. But you will not reappear tired and satisfied, and grief's repeated particles suffuse the air, like the dog yipping through the entire night, or the cat stretching awake, then curling as if to dream of her mother's milky nipples. A raccoon dislodged a geranium from its pot. Flowers, roots, and dirt lay upended in the back garden, where lilies begin their daily excursions above stone walls in the season of old roses. I pace beside weeds and snowy peonies, staring at Mount Kearsarge, where you climbed wearing purple hiking boots. Hurry back, be careful climbing down. Your peonies lean their vast heads westward as if they might topple. Some topple. I offer that concluding poem, Dawn, with thanks for all your beautiful poems that turn your grief and ours into art. And happy birthday.
I offered Don $50 for names of old horses, but he wouldn't sell it to me. I'm just going to say a little bit about how we all came to be friends. Dinner at Jane and Don's. I can't pinpoint the date, but it must have taken place in the early 80s. All four of us were still relative newcomers to New Hampshire. In 1975, after his grandmother's death at the age of 97, Jane and Don had come back from Michigan to Eagle Pond Farm. The plan was to spend a year there, but at some point the decision was taken to make a permanent move. They went back to Ann Arbor to pack up the house and then returned to Don's grandparents' farmhouse for good. In 1976, the last child gone, we had made the decision to move full-time into the ancient farmhouse we had bought on the cheap in 1963 and used carelessly as a summer camp and weekend retreat for 13 years. Repairing roofs, dealing with recalcitrant plumbing, discovering gap-toothed hay rakes and broken bits of workhorse harness in old barns were endeavors that we two couples had in common. Before dinner, a tour of the Hall Kenyon renovations. The old first-floor bathroom was no more. The bedroom had been reborn as a modern bath and laundry. A new bedroom extended from the back of the house. A sign over the bathroom door announced that this was the Caldecott room, a nod to the children's book prize Don had won for The Ox Cart Man. That award took place in 1980, which had made these renovations possible. The L created by the addition allowed for a secret garden, its bricks laid by Jane, where she cultivated her lilies that toil not nor do they spin, and labor-intensive peonies. It was high summer, and I remember the peonies, both burgundy and white, were wide open, a fulsome and fragrant flower. They had been my mother's favorite, too. No wonder a frisson went through me. I wish I could say I remembered the menu, but I do not. Don's tall, red-headed son, Andrew, was there, newly graduated from the University of Wisconsin. There were candles and flowers on the table. A good wine went round. Jane served graciously amid the animated conversation. When the main course was completed, she announced that Perkins would clear and bring in dessert. This startled me. I had until then not been aware that someone else lurked in the kitchen, waiting to perform the homely chores of cleaning up. When Don rose and began to gather the plates, I finally caught on. So much has been said and written about Perkins and Jane that I hesitate here. For more than 20 years, we remained friends on our 2 farms on either side of Kearsarge Mountain. While I may never cultivate a peony, I always think of Jane when our lilies bud up in early summer. Now I'm just going to read, without specific comment, 4 poems. The first one is Mount Kearsarge. Now, I know that Don pronounces it slightly differently, and probably his pronunciation is correct. But this is what I look at on my side, and he looks at on his. Great blue mountain, ghost, I look at you from the porch of the farmhouse where I watched you all summer as a boy. Steep sides, narrow flat patch on top. You are clear to me like the memory of one day. Blue, blue, the top of the mountain floats in haze. I will not rock on this porch when I am old. I turn my back on you, Kearsarge. I close my eyes and you rise inside me, blue ghost. It's a real favorite with me. This next poem, I have to tell Don this. Anne Sexton, it was her favorite poem of yours. Do you remember that? Yeah, Gold, yeah. And I don't know whether she called Don to have him read it to her, but she had someone who had to read it to her frequently. Gold. Pale gold of the walls, gold of the centers of daisies, yellow roses pressing from a clear bowl. All day we lay on the bed, my hand stroking the deep gold of your thighs and your back. We slept and woke, entering the golden room together, lay down in it, breathing quickly, then slowly again, caressing and dozing, your hand sleepily touching my hair now. We made in those days tiny identical rooms inside our bodies, which the men who uncover our graves will find in 1,000 years, shining and whole. It's really a great love poem, I think. I love this because it's so saucy. It's called On Reaching the Age of 200. This is a poem of Don's that I wish I had written. When I awoke on the morning of my 200th birthday, I expected to be consulted by supplicants, like the Sibyl at Cumae. I could tell them something. Last one I'm going to read of his is, it's a tiny little narrow poem on the page. I guess it's written in Demeter, 2 beats to the line. It's called Valley of Morning. And he's created a character here, Jack Baker. Jack Baker rises when the steeple clock strikes 3 to shape dough into pans and wed pale rising bread to the fire. Trays shoved in clay ovens over wood coals. After the summer sun touches the church's steeple, he pulls from his bake stove 200 loaves, crusted brown with damp fire inside. Now the valley of morning wakes, breathing bread's air, fresh loaves for the day's mouth, for meadow, lane, and row house. So I'm going to wish you a happy 200th birthday.
I'm going to read a few poems of his that I've loved for a long time. This old one called The Long River. The musk ox smells in his long head my boat coming. When I feel him there intent heavy, the oars make wings in the white night, and deep woods are close on either side where trees darken. I rode past towns in their black sleep to come here. I passed the northern grass and cold mountains. The musk ox moves when the boat stops in hard thickets. Now the wood is dark with old pleasures. So this is a poem about old joys of the body and sexuality, I assume. The musk ox smells in his long head my boat coming. When I feel him there intent heavy, the oars make wings in the white night. In deep woods are close on either side where trees darken. I rode past towns in their black sleep to come here. I passed the northern grass and cold mountains. The muskot moves when the boat stops in hard thickets. Now the wood is dark with old pleasures. Maybe it's a way certain Protestants feel. I rode past towns in their black sleep to come here. I passed the northern grass and gold, well, never mind. Anyway, you get the idea. I love that poem. And then there's The Man in the Dead Machine. It's very hard in a poem to bring together the physical world and the political world, or the world of what's happening in the whole country. And this is, we both lived through the Second World War watching it. The Man in the Dead Machine. High in a slope in New Guinea, the Grumman hellcat lodges among bright vines as thick as arms. In 1943, the clenched hand of a pilot glided it here where no one has ever been. In the cockpit, the helmeted skeleton sits upright, held by dry sinews at neck and shoulder, and by webbing that straps the pelvic cross to the cracked leather of the seat and the breastbone to the canvas cover of the parachute. Or, say that the shrapnel missed me. I flew back to the carrier, and every morning take the train, my pale hands on the black case, and sit upright, held by the firm webbing. Well, that's a bit scary. And to say that to be a businessman in New York and take the train every day with your beautiful little black case is the same as sitting in the Grumman Hellcat for 94 years. Well, I sort of like it. Whenever any insult comes in to the corporate world, I love it. And I say it's hard to do that without being brass and, gross. But he did it. And here's a little poem that he wrote for Philippa, his daughter, who's sitting in the front row right now. And she had done some little drawings and little things with crayons, probably to cheer him up. And it begins, "Here she comes, the queen of moons and stars. With orange hair, blue eyes, and yellow breasts, she floats smiling on the triangular balloon of her dress. A star juts from a pedestal on top of her head." That's the first drawing she did, apparently. Second one, a pink blob with one red eye, an orange pig's nose, blue hair and beard, over a yellow mouth. This is Daddy when he was born. Third one, the flower sings tenor under his black mustache, and sounds come out yellow. His great head rises from a thin stem. The moon queen stares with her lucid eyes, loving him. Goodbye, take care of not getting your hair wet. That's so daughterly, I love that. Exactly what daughters are like. Well, one of the poems that everyone loves a lot is Kicking the Leaves. And people say, I love this poem best of all Don's poems, and it's about being in Ann Arbor, walking home. Kicking the leaves in October as we walk home together from the game in Ann Arbor. I kick at the leaves of maple, reds of 70 different shades, yellow like old paper, and poplar leaves, fragile and pale, and elm leaves, flags of a doomed race. And he goes on describing how it was like walking outdoors to school in Connecticut wearing October knickers that swished with a sound like leaves. And kicking the leaves, autumn 1955 in Massachusetts, knowing my father would die when the leaves were gone. So then in part 7 he says, now I fall, now I leap and fall to feel the leaves crush under my body, to feel my body buoyant in the ocean of leaves, the night of them, night heaving with death and leaves rocking like the ocean. Oh, this delicious falling into the arms of leaves, into the soft laps of leaves. Face down, I swim into the leaves, feathery, breathing the acrid odor of maple, swooping in long glides to the bottom of October, where the farm lies curled against winter, and soup steams its breath of onion and carrots onto damp curtains and windows. And past the windows I see the tall, bare maple trunks and branches, the oak with its few brown, weathery remnant leaves, and the spruce trees holding their green. Now I leap and fall exultant, recovering from death, on account of death, in accord with the dead, the smell and taste of leaves again, and the pleasure, the only long pleasure, of taking a place in the story of leaves. So that's sweet, to kick the leaves and then understand that the real pleasure is taking your place in the sequence of life and death in your own family. And there's a lot of that in Don. But I remember I met him long ago when we were in college together, and then we went different ways. And this is a poem he wrote in Ann Arbor. And I remember a nice scene in Ann Arbor, because I would come to see him, and I walked in his door one day, and his secretary, he always had very smart secretaries, secretary was in the room just off the hall, and she said, are you going to visit Dawn? I said, yes. How long? About 3 days. She said, listen, I got to tell you something. I know from reading your letters to Dawn that you're a Capricorn. I mean, that amazed me in itself. You have to know that Dawn is a Virgo. I said, so? She said, well, you know, Virgos are very neat. And Capricorns of your sort are hopelessly sloppy. So I'm advising you to be careful. So, you know, what can you do? So I thought of it the next morning. I opened the refrigerator, and I took an egg, and by accident I dropped it, and it hit the floor. So I took my foot and I kicked it under the... And Don said, what did you do? What are you doing? What are you doing? I just kicked it under the refrigerator, you know. So that caused a wonderful opera for a while. And then I remember, maybe a night or two later, I got up in the middle of the night and I went downstairs and I ate a little can of stuff he had there in the refrigerator. And he came down and he found the empty can. Did you eat this last night? Yeah. You ate a whole can of pâté de foie gras yourself. I said, I thought it was meatloaf, you know, and so. But still, there's something wonderful in all of that, because two Virgos can't be friends. You know, to be friends over 30, 40 years, you got to be opposites, hopeless opposites. That'll never, so we have to keep forgiving each other. That's the only way to do that. Shall I tell another story on that one? Well, this one's a little more revealing, but anyway, we were saying he had gone to Ann Arbor and become a teacher and was, relatively wealthy, and he had antiques in his house. And I was living in Minnesota in an old ratty farmhouse with no antiques at all. And so we were sitting there at dinner, and I got jealous. So you should always respond in some way to this sort of feeling. So I took my beer and poured it into his, what was it? It was, Yes, I poured my beer into his Spanish rice. And so he said nothing. He looked at me, and he went out and poured out the beer out of his Spanish rice. Got another thing, did you? Brought it back and poured it over my head. And you poured the beer over my head, yeah. And so the two wives looked terrified, but actually that settled the whole thing. And it was we hugged and everything. It was exactly the right thing to do. So if conversation is difficult, I'm giving you that as advice. You can always do that. So we're still opposites, and we write each other usually every week a long letter, and I tell all the things I'm doing, and he tells all the things he's doing. You can't believe that we're living in the same time. Anyway. Here's a little one, The Ox Cart Man, and many of you know that. It's the most marvelous children's book. And he talks about the ox cart man who takes his potatoes and he puts them in the ox cart and all of the honey and combs and linen he has, and he walks by the ox's head. He goes to Portsmouth Market, sells the potatoes in the bag that carried potatoes. Flaxseed, he sells the birch brooms, the maple sugar, goose feathers, and yarn. When the cart is empty, he sells the cart. When the cart is sold, he sells the ox, harness and yoke, and walks home his pockets heavy with the year's coin for salt and taxes. And at home by fire's light in November cold, stitches new harness for next year's ox in the barn, and carves the yoke and saws planks, building the cart again. That's sort of like what it is with poetry. You write something, then you take it to the New Yorker and you sell it, and you're never going to see it again. And so the only thing you can do is go home and write another one. Stitch new harness for next year's ox in the barn, carve the yoke and saws planks, building the cart again. So that's what we love in someone like Don, that he keeps working and he builds the cart again. All right, now I'm going to read a poem here which I adore, called The Baseball Players. Against the bright grass, the white-knickered players tent, seize, and attend. A moment ago, outfielders and infielders adjusted their clothing, glanced at the sun, and settled forward, hands on knees. The pitcher walked back to the hill, established his cap, and returned. The catcher twitched a forefinger. The batter rotated his bat in a slow circle, but now they pause, wary, exact, suspended. So he's got that moment just before the ball comes. Then he says, while abiding moonrise lightens the angel of the overgrown garden, and Walter Blake Adams, who died at 14, waits under the footbridge. Ooh, that's really good. And he has beautiful work with the sound. Against the bright grass, the white-knickered players' tents. He's going to use some ends now. Seize and attend. A moment ago, outfielders and infielders adjusted their clothing, glanced at the sun, and settled forward. So, and the meaning of it in some way is that unless you work with sound carefully, as you already pointed out he does, unless you work with that, you can't create that moment in which Walter Blake Adams, who died at 14, waits under the footbridge. Something intensely deep and mysterious cannot happen unless you really work with sound. So that's a testimony to his wonderful greatness as an artist. I'll read a couple more here. Whitman, it's a wonderful idea of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson marrying. Have you ever thought about that? He thought about it. It's called The Impossible Marriage. The bride disappears. After 20 minutes of searching, we discover her in the cellar, vanish against a pillar in her white gown and her skin's original pallor. When we guide her back to the altar, we find the groom in his slouch hat, open shirt, and untended beard, withdrawn to the bell tower with a healthy young sexton, from whose comradeship we detach him with difficulty. Oh, never in all the meeting houses and academies of compulsory democracy and free-thinking Calvinism will these poets marry. Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Oh, pale, passionate anchoret of Amherst. Oh, reticent cosmos of Brooklyn. All right, I'm just about done here. In the day I was older, from the Studebaker's back seat on our Sunday drives, I watched her earrings sway. Then I walked uphill beside an old man carrying buckets under birches on an August day. Striding in noontime, I looked at wheat and at river cities. In the crib, my daughter sighed, opening her eyes. I kissed the cheek of my father dying. By the pond, an acorn fell. You listening here, you reading these words as I write them, I offer this cup to you. Though we drink from this cup every day, we will never drink it dry. So the last poem I want to read is a stanza he wrote for Jane. I don't know, there's been so much death and suffering, and him keeping himself alert, affectionate. He woke at 5, brewed coffee, swallowed pills, injected insulin, shaved, ate breakfast, packed the tote with Jane's sweats that he washed at night, filled the thermos, and left the apartment on Spring Street to walk a block and a half to the hospital's bone marrow floor, waiting for the light to cross the avenue. Briefly, he imagined throwing himself in front of that bus. He knew he wouldn't. So, I just want to say that of all the things that I admire about Don, and if I had one word that I would use for him, it would be faithfulness. He's been faithful to his uncle, to his grandfather and grandmother. He's been faithful to this farm. He's been immensely faithful to his children and immensely faithful to Jane. He's faithful. He's a faithful man, and I'm honored to know him.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for coming here. Thank you so much for my friends for talking as you've talked. Thanks so many people. There are lists of organizations here, but you are people one at a time. Mike is here, but there are many others too who have done so much to make this happen. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of joy for me, and thank you. Just marvelous. I loved hearing Cynthia perform my sounds like that. Boy, you're listening. You've been listening all along, I know, but that was lovely to hear. I talk about it all the time, sounds, and talk about it to my friends, but I seldom hear anybody in a critical way talk about sound so intricately, and it really cheers me up if somebody is there. I've knew Cynthia first, as she told you, in Ann Arbor, before we both, oddly, moved eventually to New Hampshire. And although we are fairly close to each other, we continue, as we did before, to read each other's poems by correspondence. She's a marvelous critic and very tough. I hesitate sending things to her sometimes because I know I'm going to get my feelings hurt and so on, you know. But what are you in it for? You know, she hurts them usefully, and she's very, very good. Wes told about our meeting. I'll just never forget that first night. His old students brought over this nice guy. And, you know, I liked him. He was kind of shy. He seemed very likable. And so I just hated it that I had this pile of paper beside my chair afterwards because I was going to look at it and it was going to be terrible. It almost always is. And I picked it up, and I cannot remember the name of the first poem I looked at. But the first poem I looked at was just wonderful. It wasn't like anybody else. It wasn't very short. It was 8 or 10 lines. And it just took off, and its language took off. It flew. It was so good. And Jane would tell you about it if she were here. She remembers. I told her about it. She was across the room, and I read her aloud things and so on, and so she became a great enthusiast as well. And I did love hearing those things from letters that I told him when things were kind of discouraging at the beginning. I don't remember them in a sense. I certainly don't remember the letters that I wrote him, but I remember them very well because I say them every day now. And guess who I say them to? You know, that's where they come from. I've been saying them to myself since, finally at some point in my 20s, I realized that writing was the only thing, that publication was just fine, but it didn't solve anything, and it didn't mean you were any good. So what have you got? You've got the desk, the table, the endeavor, well, you might have your 76th birthday if you're very lucky, I suppose, too. But I say those things to myself, and I'm glad I said them to Wes. And I'm talking with Maxine, I remember our long New Hampshire friendship, too. And so much of it was, until the last 10 years, a friendship of four, of the four of us getting together, sometimes with others as well, to talk poetry. And I think of how terribly important Maxine was for Jane. When Jane was first here, she was just beginning to write her best poem. And then she wrote some of the best, but practically nobody knew about it. And Maxine was enormously supportive for Jane, and there for her again and again. It was a very late development that when Maxine finished her tour of duty as a poet laureate, it was she who named or arranged whatever for Jane to succeed her. But earlier, when Jane hadn't published anything and so on, support was much more valuable, and it was always there from Max, who is a true friend in poetry to Jane and to me and to so many of us. And, Robert, you have a way of shortening the years, you know. You said something about us knowing each other for 30 or 40 years when Mike had already made it clear that it was 56. He's a Capricorn and I'm a Virgo, and I'm tidy, right? Last night I wanted him to sleep in my parlor, and he wouldn't sleep there because it was not tidy enough. Deny it if you dare.
Where's I going to sleep?
It's always covered with boxes. But so he decided to sleep upstairs, but there isn't any heat upstairs, so he froze to death and came downstairs. But the Capricorn can't stand an untidy room. I'm sorry to report this. No, he's the kind of, he loves tidiness as long as his mother picks up for him. And anyway, our friendship began in poetry. I was trying out for the literary magazine at Harvard, and Robert was already an editor, one of the people who would approve of me or not, and we met. And he was tall, lean, red-haired. He was a veteran of the Navy. I was 19 and he was 22, but I had the distinct impression he was about 26 and had just got back from Saipan or something. He was scary. He was very, very smart. And we talked about books that we loved right then and there. Robert Lowell's Lord Weary's Castle, for instance. And I look forward to coming back the next time to talk with him some more. And of course, it was not very long before we were writing letters to each other when we were apart, but otherwise seeing each other, reading each other's poems, hitchhiking with each other on one famous disastrous occasion. And the friendship has just been enormous for all these years. There have been a couple of bad patches, but Nothing extensive. Oh, we fought. We have fought a lot. Well, I mean bad patches, but very little, very little. And so that the last time I heard somebody at UNH estimated that they had 20,000 letters between the two of us down there. Now it's fax most of the time, so it's a little quicker, but it's still letters, the same thing. And the subject is everything. It's all of our lives, but the subject is always what it was the first night we met each other. It is the love of poetry and the attempt to make ourselves some of the stuff that we love. It has been a friendship that's been at the center of my life since I was 19 years old, and has been of vast importance to me. And this love of opposites. We are total opposites, and no sooner does one of us take a position that the other has to realize he's really in the opposite position. If he loves Jung, I have to love Freud, and the other way around.
You do that, too.
What?
You're wrong to love Freud and not Jung.
Yeah, I'm wrong in every single case, of course. We all understand that. Anyway, I want to read a few poems before I let us go off to Monday Night Football. What?
We got a reception before that. Too.
Oh, we got to, all right, fine, okay. I'll be quick. I'm going to begin by, oh, by the way, Cynthia, you read 3 poems, and one was about, you didn't know this, of course. One was about 40 years old, one was 30 years old, one was 20 years old. And I'm going to read one that's 50 years old. This is the poem that, probably a poem of mine that's been in more anthologies than any other. A poem that I wrote when my son, Andrew, was born. And it's titled in the first line of the same. My son, my executioner, I take you in my arms, quiet and small and just astir, and whom my body warms. Sweet death, small son, our instrument of immortality, your cries and hungers document our bodily decay. We, 25 and 22, who seemed to live forever, observe enduring life in you, and start to die together. Now I'm going to read one longish poem and then end with a couple of short things. This is a poem I want to read for a particular reason, and I'm sure you'll understand the reason when you hear it. It's called Great Day in the Cow's House. In the dark tie-up, 7 huge Holsteins lower their heads to feed, chained loosely to old saplings with whitewashed bark still on them. They are long dead. They survive in the great day that cancels the successiveness of creatures. Now she stretches her wrinkly neck, her turnip eye rolls in her skull, she sucks up breath, and stretching her long mouth mid-chew, she expels. Yes, that's why I had to read it. The poem goes on for quite a while, but I have 2 granddaughters here tonight, and for a while, they're too old for this now, but for a while I was known as Grampy Cow, because when I wanted to amuse them, I made that noise over and over again. But, and of course, Robert tells me it's the best line I ever wrote. So, all right, you have to imagine that noise again. Sweet bellowers, enormous and interchangeable, your dolorous ululations swell out barnside, fill spaces inside haymouths, resound down valleys. Moos of revenant cattle shake ancient timbers, and timbers still damp with sap. Now it is warm, late June. The old man strokes white braids of milk, strip, strip, from ruminant beasts with hip bones like tent poles, the rough black and white hanging crudely upon them. Now he tilts back his head to recite a poem about an old bachelor who loves a chicken named Susan. His voice grows loud with laughter and emphasis in the silent tie-up where old noises gather. Now a tail lifts to waterfall, huge and yellow, or an enormous flop presses out. Done milking, he lifts with his hoe a leather-hinged board to scrape manure onto the pile underneath, in April carted for garden and field corn. The cows in their house decree the seasons: spring seeds corn, summer haze, autumn fences, and winter saws ice from Eagle Pond, sledging it uphill to pack it away in sawdust. Through August parch and Indian summer, great chunks of the pond float in the milkshed tank. Pull down the spider webs, whitewash the tie-up. In the great day, there is also the odor of poverty and anxiety over the agricultural inspector's visit. They are long dead. They survive in the great day of August to convene afternoon and morning for milking. Now they graze Ragged Mountain, steep sugar bush, little mountain valleys and brooks, high clovery meadows, slate-colored low bush blueberries. When grass is sweetest, they are slow to leave it. Late afternoons, he spends hours searching. He knows their secret places. He listens for one peal of a cowbell carried on a breeze. He calls, "Kabosh, kabosh, kabosh, kabosh." He climbs dry creek beds and old logging roads, or struggles up needle banks, pulling on fir branches. He hacks with his jackknife a chunk of spruce gum, oozing from bark, and softens it in his cheek pouch for chewing. Then he pushes through Hemlock's Gate to join the Society of Holsteins. They look up from grass as if mildly surprised and file immediately downwards. Late in October, after grass freezes, the cattle remain in their stalls, twice a day loose to walk stiff-legged to the watering trough, from which the old man lifts a white lid of ice. Twice a day he shovels ensilage into their stalls and shakes hay down from the loft, stuffing a forkful under each steaming nose. In late winter, one after one, the pink-white udders dry out as new calves swell their mothers' bellies. Now these vessels of hugeness bear, one after one, skinny-limbed small Holsteins, eager to suck the bounty of freshening. Now he climbs to the barn in boots and overalls, 2 sweaters, a cloth cap, and somebody's old woolen coat. Now he parts the calf from its mother after feeding and strips the udder clean to rejoice in the sweet, frothing tonnage of milk. Now it is April, when snow remains on the north side of boulders and sugar maples, and green starts from wet earth in open places the sun touches. He unchains the cows one morning after milking and lopes past them to open the pasture gate. Now he returns, whooping and slapping their buttocks to set them to pasture again, and they are free to wander eating all day long. Now these wallowing, big-eyed calf makers, bone rafters for leather, awkward arcs, cud-chewing, lethargic mooers, roll their enormous heads, trot, gallop, bounce, cavort, stretch, leap, and bellow, as if everything heavy and cold vanished at once, and cow spirits floated, weightless as clouds, in the great day's windy April. When his neighbor discovers him at 87, his head leans into the side of his last Holstein. She has kicked the milk pail over and blue milk drains through floorboards onto the manure pile in the great day. The Long River Kicking Prophecy, my son. I'm going to conclude now by reading just two shorter poems from The Painted Bed, both of which actually I have revised a little since the book was printed. The first one is, I read you the metrical rhymed poem I wrote 50 years ago, and this is the only one I'm reading you, other one I'm reading you. It's called Her Garden. It's Jane's Peonies again, from a later time, and another poem of grief for Jane. I let her garden go, let it go, let it go. How can I watch the hummingbird hover to sip with its beak's tip the purple bee balm, whirring as we heard it years ago? The weeds rise rank and thick, let it go, let it go. Where annuals grew and burdock grows, where standing she at once could see the peony, the lily, and the rose rise over brick she'd laid in patterns, moss. Let it go, let it go. Turns the bricks green, softening them by the gray rocks where hollyhocks that lofted while she lived, stem by tall stem, blossom with loss. The other is revised almost entirely by cutting, and it's both of these are in the supplement in the revised form, but this is called Distressed Haiku. In a week or 10 days, the snow and ice will melt from Cemetery Road. I'm coming, don't move. You think that their dying is the worst thing that could happen. Then they stay dead. Will Hall ever write lines that do anything but whine and complain? The mouse rips the throat of the lion. The Boston Red Sox win 100 straight games. And the dead return. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good.
There is a reception right here, and the poets will be over there with some books, and also I believe there might be a birthday cake over there that you can all get a piece of. Thanks very much for coming again.